John, would you describe the evolution of your thinking around board practices that led you to create the policy governance model and to write your first book, Boards That Make a Difference?
Oh boy, yeah, that was a time of turmoil. I had learned management by finding out how little I knew about it, and then trying to get better. After going through a PhD program in clinical psychology, I wasn't ready for that. After I started to get a feeling for management, I found out that I was woefully stupid about governance. I couldn't understand. I worked for boards at that time. In fact, I was on boards myself. I chaired a national board during that period of time, and I still didn't understand governance. It didn't make sense to me. So what drove me was well, frankly, a feeling of profound stupidity. That's what drove me. I've got to make sense out of this. And the more I read and the more I studied of what had been written at that time, the more I became convinced that the reason I couldn't make sense out of it was that it didn't make sense, that it was that simple. And so then it was like, okay, if I can't make sense out of it the way it is can I think it through in a way that does make sense to me? And I set out to do that. I think serendipitously, as a matter of fact, I did it by stripping away, in the sense of the sculptor who strips away all the stone so that the David is left, that kind of idea. So I started asking myself questions about what truths are there about the governing body role, which would be true, which would be so in any circumstance. So if I said, okay, would an executive committee be like this or this, I'd have to throw that away because not all boards usually have to have an executive committee. Or should a committee be like this or this? Wait a minute, not all boards need committees. So those aren't universal. So I kept throwing out things that were universal. At the time, people were saying that boards are so different, one from another, that in fact you can't find things that are true of all of them. They're all different. Well, of course they're all different. But the job of finding out what's true of all of them will in fact get to the foundation upon which all that other variety is built. So that's what I was doing, and I would get to the point of saying, well, can I find anything that is true of all governing boards, is true or should be true? And well, of course, yes, I start with something simple. They should all know what their job is. Well, that's kind of silly, but the thing is, okay, that's universal. I found one. And now that I've found one, I know it's not impossible to find a universal truth. So now after that, what's next? And that's what led to the policy governance model, was going through and reducing right down to the point where I could not reduce it further. And it came up with just a few basic principles with some concepts to hold them in place. And that's how I got the policy governance model.
Good. So I'm going to ask you next. Would you describe then those essential ideas that make up the policy governance model?
The essential ideas of the policy governance model, well, there are several, and I'll give you a quick rundown on some of them. One idea is that the board holds its authority and must express its authority as a group, never as parts. For example, the committee has no power over the staff, the board does. The chair has no power over staff, the board does, that kind of thing. So it's a unitary body in expressing and holding its authority and accountability. Another is that boards are representative bodies, or yes, representative spokesperson kind of bodies of an ownership of some sort. The ownership might be as clear as shareholders in an equity corporation, or as clear as members in a membership corporation, membership association. But in any event, it's some kind of body of human beings that we can look at as morally or legally owning the organization. For some organizations, it's very easy, like the ones I just mentioned. For other ones, it's harder, like a public television station. Who's the ownership? Well, you have to play with that idea for a while. But anyway, no matter what the ownership is, the board is speaking on their behalf. On their behalf. Another of the essential elements is that the board, when it expresses what it needs to say to a management system, that it must do so in such a way as to find the optimal balance between empowerment and rigorous accountability. In other words, there is it means business with this delegation, but it also is it wants to give as much freedom as possible for people to use their own creativity and their own thinking. Another is that the board should deal with the largest questions very carefully, not voluminously, just carefully, and then ask themselves as a board, are we willing, having said the broadest thing possible about, say, what we exist for, or what ethics and prudence values do we want to observe, that kind of thing. Having spoken to those things in the broadest level, ask themselves, are we willing to let somebody else use any reasonable interpretation of those words and take off with the empowerment to take them into smaller decisions. And if we're not willing to give somebody that right, then we must say some more. But the board then steps through the descending breadths of decision making. And at some point, the board says, look, we've nailed that down far enough that we are willing to accept any reasonable interpretation of what we said. We let go of it. And at that point, it's turned over to, for the most part, a CEO, a chief executive officer, who then decides how to take the division of labor further. But it's a level by level specificity that doesn't exist in other approaches to governance. So that when you think of the difference between board and staff, it's a difference that relates more to what level at which a decision takes place than the topic. For example, budget. Who authorizes the budget? In policy governance, the staff does, not the board. But it does so under larger decisions about budgeting and financial planning that the board has set. For example, the basic values that must be found in the budgeting process are these. And if you stick with those values, then any set of numbers will be okay. That kind of thinking. So we're able to actually start from the outside and work in. It gives the board a way of having its arms around the organization and never having its fingers in it. It gives a way for the board to say, yes, we as a group set our values out at the front end, not later, but extremely in fact, everything's proactive this way. The board starts the ball rolling. It's not the final decision maker, as we often say, it's the initial decision maker. So it rolls in that direction. And by doing that, what happens is that keeps the board closer to the values of the ownership than the kinds of decisions that staff makes. So instead of seeing the board, as we usually do, as management one step up, we see it as ownership one step down. Changes the whole thing, absolutely changes the whole thing. So the model does that. It also gives ways in which we can know what information a board needs and which information it just gets bedazzled by. The fancy footwork kind of show us a lot of PowerPoint presentations approach to governing knowledge. It's much more specific about what information they need. It's much more specific about how you do CEO evaluation relatively painlessly. So the model has a number of essential characteristics. I'm sure I have not mentioned all of them there, but that probably gives you a flavor of the kinds of breakthrough approaches that exist in the model. Oh, I better add one. It's a model. It's a totally consistent, conceptually coherent system, not just a set of tips.